tonight, the geopolitical tension over a distant conflict has suddenly become immediate and acute, directly involving the United States in a way that demands immediate decision-making. The current crisis was set in motion by a successful missile strike executed by Ukraine. However, the consequences of that single strike did not stop at the battlefield. They escalated rapidly, landing squarely on the desk of the U.S. president. The event has created profound internal tremors at the Pentagon and forced Washington to squarely address the core strategic question that has shadowed this entire war. How far is the West truly prepared to escalate its support when Russia deliberately attempts to draw a line in the sand with the warning, stop, or face the consequences? This is the confirmed intelligence. Within the last 48 hours, Ukrainian forces successfully carried out a significant strike against major Russian troop concentrations situated in occupied territory. This was an attack that Moscow cannot plausibly deny or simply dismiss as a minor, localized tactical loss. Crucially, this was not a routine artillery skirmish over some remote trench line. It was a calculated, deep strike against infrastructure that Russia falsely claims as its own, but which the global community recognizes as illegally occupied Ukrainian sovereign land. For months, Russia has been utilizing occupied territories, such as Crimea and the air bases and logistical depots within the regions it claims as secure operational sanctuaries for its war machine, places from which it launches devastating campaigns against Ukrainian cities. Now, Russian officials are explicitly confirming that this precise strike was conducted using long-range weapon systems provided by Western allies, missiles authorized by Washington, designed specifically to hit the very assets Moscow assumed were safely beyond the reach of the front lines. In direct reaction, the Kremlin executed a highly calculated and overtly public diplomatic maneuver. They formally summoned the U.S. ambassador in Moscow. This specific action is never an accident. It is performed solely when a major power intends to send a forceful, unmistakable signal, not just to Washington, but to the entire world. Following the summons, they issued what they described in the harshest terms as a severe warning to the United States. Russian officials spoke ominously of major consequences, accusations of the U.S. crossing new red lines, and stated that America bore direct culpability for the destruction and loss of life resulting from the strike, based on the fact that American-made weapons struck territory that Russia officially refers to as its own. While this type of language is not unprecedented, the sheer intensity of the tone, the deliberate emphasis, and the public theatrics, the formal summons, the presence of news cameras outside the foreign ministry all signify that Moscow has chosen to utilize diplomatic escalation to underscore that it views this specific incident as a critical test case of Western resolve. When Russia undertakes such an action, it is more than mere performance. A formal diplomatic summons, where the ambassador is effectively called in and reprimanded for his nation's actions, typically represents the immediate precursor to more serious steps, such as expelling diplomats, severing essential communication channels, or initiating worse measures. Russia's objective here is clearly defined: to strategically separate the United States from Ukraine. They are attempting to shift the international narrative from Ukraine is defending itself against an unlawful invasion to the deeply manipulative claim that the United States is actively attacking Russia through a proxy. By successfully achieving this, they believe they can claim that any subsequent retaliation, whether cyber warfare, direct military action, or hybrid attacks, is not an extension of the war in Ukraine, but an unfortunate part of a wider clash with the West. The hope is that this will successfully alarm American voters, frighten European capitals, and ultimately shatter the international support coalition sustaining Kyiv. This complex move is a blend of information warfare and high-stakes diplomacy centered around a critical battlefield event. Washington, however, did not respond by attempting to ignore the reality of the situation. Internally, the administration immediately initiated a high-level scramble. Secure video conferences connected the White House, the Pentagon, the State Department, and U.S. military commanders stationed in Europe. Intelligence briefers meticulously detailed their assessment of the strike, what specific asset was targeted, the type of missile used, whether any U.S. personnel were in the vicinity, how accurately the Russian narrative matched independent satellite and signals intelligence, and, most urgently, what Moscow might be preparing as a retaliatory step. This is always the first, most pressing question in the strategic planning rooms. Is this purely diplomatic escalation, or are we observing synchronized troop movements, missile redeployments, or cyber probing activity that suggests Russia is backing its angry statement with something concrete? Simultaneously, the State Department faced a decision. Should they minimize the incident or meet it directly? Judging by the public statements issued, the choice was to respond assertively but with careful, calibrated language. The consistent U.S. public stance has been, yes, the United States provides Ukraine with the necessary means to defend its sovereignty. Yes, we support Ukraine's sovereign right to strike legitimate military targets used to kill Ukrainian civilians. No, providing these tools does not render America a direct combatant in the war. Washington firmly restated that it neither encourages nor supports attacks on internationally recognized Russian territory, that it prioritizes the avoidance of uncontrolled escalation, and that Russia remains the party fundamentally violating international law through its unlawful occupation of Ukrainian land and its continuous missile and drone attacks targeting cities, power grids, and residential areas. But the most difficult, quiet decision Washington must make following such a warning involves communication with allies behind closed doors and coordination with Ukraine. If Russia is now openly threatening grave consequences for a strike utilizing long-range, Western-supplied weapons, this challenge strikes directly at the heart of the entire coalition's strategy for the future. Ukraine's ability to survive this war fundamentally depends on neutralizing Russia's operational sanctuary, those airfields, supply depots, command posts, and logistics hubs that currently operate safely behind the front lines and relentlessly rain missiles and bombs onto Ukrainian cities. Ukraine cannot effectively defend itself if it is compelled to fight with severe restrictions, limited only to the immediate front line, while Russia attacks freely from deep within occupied territory. Consequently, Washington and key European capitals have been inching closer to granting Kyiv precisely the capacity that Moscow is now vehemently protesting. This is the exact point where domestic U.S. political considerations violently clash with military strategy in Ukraine. On one side, you have a public weary of war, facing congressional debates over aid continuation and hearing political leaders tell voters that Europe must increase its share, that Ukraine should perhaps accept a settlement, and that the U.S. is shouldering too much of the burden. Simultaneously, a bipartisan coalition in Congress, national security leaders across multiple administrations, and virtually every major U.S. ally firmly insist that if Russia is allowed to dictate the terms of this war by using the threat of escalation every time Ukraine gains an advantage, the result is not avoided escalation, it is rewarded aggression. This teaches the Kremlin that nuclear saber-rattling and explicit threats are effective tools. Therefore, when Russia issues a harsh warning to the U.S. after this successful Ukrainian strike, Washington's response is not a matter of mere talking points. It is making fundamental strategic choices that will resonate for years. One option is to quietly concede, subtly restrict how Ukraine can use U.S. weapons, rewrite agreements to require explicit case-by-case approval for specific targets, and perhaps intentionally delay future long-range system deliveries. This approach would momentarily reduce diplomatic tension with Moscow. However, it would also unambiguously signal to the Kremlin that its strategy was effective, that threatening consequences for a Ukrainian attack on a command center can indeed force a change in U.S. policy. The alternative option is to firmly hold the current policy line or even cautiously strengthen it. This means making it unequivocally clear that as long as Russia launches attacks from a military base, that base remains a legitimate military target, even if it is located in occupied territory that Russia falsely claims as its own. It means asserting that for Ukraine to survive, it has the inherent right to sever the logistical arms that are actively trying to destroy it. This does not mean Washington will grant a blank check for every target. Every administration maintains its own quiet boundaries. But it means refusing to permit the Kremlin to dictate the rules of engagement. Judging by the initial reaction, the public commitment that U.S. support will continue, the assurances to allies that the principles of defense remain unchanged, and the calm, measured response to Russia's threats, it appears, at least for the moment, that Washington is attempting to execute this second path, refusing to back down, avoiding matching Russia's rhetorical intensity, but firmly denying Moscow the power to unilaterally define what is permissible. There is another critical dimension to this crisis that must be discussed, as it is easy to become focused on the immediate drama and miss the underlying strategic dynamic. For months, Russia has been continuously escalating its own campaign, launching relentless waves of missiles and drones against Ukraine's energy system, civilian apartment complexes, and essential infrastructure. These attacks are not only tragic losses of life, they are a calculated strategy designed to break the morale of the Ukrainian population, freeze the country into submission, and send a clear message to the West: you cannot protect your ally. In this context, Ukraine's successful strike on a crucial Russian military site is not random escalation. It is part of a deliberate, necessary effort to push the costs of this conflict back onto the aggressor, demonstrating to Russia that there is an unavoidable price to be paid for executing a campaign of terror from what it believes is a position of safe distance. Russia's harsh warning, therefore, is not rooted in some abstract diplomatic principle. It is rooted in a genuine fear that Western support is finally enabling Ukraine to make this strategy work. This is precisely where Washington's final response matters most, not just for the immediate fate of Ukraine and Russia, but for every nation watching this geopolitical test from the sidelines, including China, Iran, North Korea, and every potential aggressor currently calculating whether military force can achieve their political objectives. If the message emanating from Washington is, "We will support you until the other side gets genuinely angry, and then we will reconsider our policies," that defines a fundamentally different and far more dangerous world than one where the message is, "We will not be coerced out of defending our allies and the foundational rules of the international system." The stakes here are not confined to one airbase, one missile, or even one specific war. They are about determining whether armed aggression, once initiated, can be effectively managed and sustained purely through diplomatic threats. Inside Ukraine tonight, this debate is lived very differently. They are not dissecting diplomatic language. They are sitting in the dark because another power plant has been hit. They are standing in line for emergency water because another key substation has been destroyed. They are mourning neighbors killed in apartment buildings and city centers struck in broad daylight. For them, the critical question is brutally simple. Will the West grant them not only the necessary weapons, but also the political authorization to strike back in a way that might actually force a change in Russia's military calculus? Or will every single effective strike be immediately followed by a panicked meeting in Washington where the main concern is not how to prevent the next Russian attack, but rather how to prevent Moscow from becoming too angry? So, when we analyze the headline, Russia sends harsh warning to U.S. after Ukraine strike, Washington responds, what we are truly observing is a test. It is not a test of who can use the loudest rhetoric, but a critical test of whether the United States and its allies genuinely believe their own core arguments about why this war matters. If we proclaim that borders cannot be unilaterally changed by force, then we must accept that actively assisting Ukraine in resisting that force will inevitably provoke the aggressor. If we assert that civilians must not be targeted, then we must accept that striking the military bases and airfields from which those attacks originate is a legitimate act of self-defense. If we declare that smaller, non-nuclear countries should not be abandoned to face nuclear-armed bullies alone, then we must accept that those nuclear-armed bullies will absolutely issue threats when they feel their strategic leverage beginning to slip away. Tonight, Moscow has successfully done what it so often attempts. It has tried to flip the script, turning the focus from its own aggression to its perceived victimhood, changing the story from Russia launched another missile attack to Russia is being attacked by the West. Washington's definitive response will determine whether that manipulative narrative takes hold. If the United States maintains a steady, firm course, continuing to support Ukraine's right to defend itself, coordinating closely with allies, and keeping its own rhetoric calm but unyielding, then Russia's harsh warning will ultimately be seen in hindsight for what it truly is. A sign that the strategy of helping Ukraine reach deeper into the aggressor's war machine is decisively working.